The sun is shining over the green fields of England. On the horizon, an army is coming closer. This is not just any army. They are the Vikings, the scariest warriors in all of Europe. They are led by one of Norway's greatest kings, Harald Hardrada. They just won a big battle and think England will soon be theirs. But they don't know that in just a few hours, something will happen that will completely change history. This something is so powerful that it will destroy the entire Viking army. It will also mark the end of Vikings invading England forever. This is the story of the Battle of Stamford Bridge. It is a fight that changed the fate of countries, and most people don't know the whole story. To fully understand what happened on that important September day, we need to go back in time. We need to learn about what led to this big moment. The year 1066 was not just another normal year. It was a year of danger, of people wanting power, of lives connected together, and of big forces about to crash into each other. England was in the middle of a political storm that had been building for many years. The events about to happen would decide who would rule England and also change the future of all of Europe. January 1066 started with something sad that shook England's power. Edward the Confessor, the King of England, died without leaving a son to take his place. His death was not just the loss of a king. It started one of the most complicated and bloody fights for the throne in medieval history. Edward had been king for more than 20 years, but he could not or would not have a son. This left an empty throne that many people wanted to fill. These people were not ordinary. Each one had strong reasons to be king, loyal armies, and a strong desire to claim the English crown. The first person to benefit from Edward's death was Harold Godwinson. Harold was not from the royal family, but he was the most powerful man in England after the king. As Earl of Wessex, he controlled huge areas of land and had the loyalty of many English nobles. Harold was a skilled military leader and a good administrator. He had something no other person wanting to be king had at that time. He was in London when Edward died. Being close to the center of power was very important. The day after Edward's death, Harold was crowned King of England by the Archbishop of York. It was a quick coronation, almost rushed, as if Harold knew that time was his biggest enemy. But Harold's claim would not go unchallenged. Across the English Channel in Normandy, another man was watching what was happening in England very carefully. William, Duke of Normandy, had his own dreams of becoming King of England. William said that Edward the Confessor had promised him the crown years earlier. More than that, William said that Harold himself had sworn loyalty to him during a visit to Normandy in 1064. Whether this was true or not, William was determined to take the throne by force. He immediately began gathering an invasion army, building a fleet of ships, and hiring warriors from all across France. The Norman invasion was coming, but it would take months to get ready. Meanwhile, far up north in Europe, a third person wanting the throne was watching with growing interest. Harald Hardrada, whose name literally means the merciless or the stern, was the king of Norway. He was probably the most experienced and feared warrior of his time. Harald Hardrada was no ordinary man. His life was like an epic adventure story. He had served in the Varangian Guard in Constantinople, the elite Viking warriors who protected the Byzantine emperor. He had fought in battles from the Mediterranean to the Black Sea, gathering unbelievable riches and a reputation for being fierce that made kings tremble. Standing over 6.5 feet tall, Harald Hardrada was truly a giant, and his ambition was as big as he was. Harold's claim to the English throne was based on an agreement between his predecessor, Magnus the Good, and Harthacnut, who had been King of England and Denmark. According to this agreement, if either of them died without sons, the other would inherit both kingdoms. Although this agreement was very old and legally questionable, for Harold, it was reason enough. More importantly, he had the ships and warriors to back up his claim. And he had an important ally inside England itself. That ally was Tostig Godwinson, Harold's own exiled brother. Tostig was an interesting piece in this political puzzle. He had been Earl of Northumbria, but his cruel rule and endless taxes led to a rebellion in 1065. His brother Harold had sided against him, supporting the rebellion to keep peace in the kingdom. Tostig was forced to leave England, and his heart was filled with bitterness and a desire for revenge. He spent months traveling around Europe, looking for allies to help him get his lands back and take revenge on his brother. When he met Harald Hardrada, he found not only an ally but a perfect partner for revenge. The partnership between Harald Hardrada and Tostig was based on goals that worked together. Harold wanted the English crown. Tostig wanted to get back his earldom and destroy his brother. Together they began planning an invasion that would be the largest Viking expedition to England in generations. Harold gathered an impressive fleet of about 300 longships, the feared Viking dragon ships that had terrorized European coasts for centuries. These ships carried between 10,000 and 15,000 warriors, the best of Scandinavian fighting men. These were men who had grown up with swords in their hands, who thought dying in battle was the greatest honor possible, who knew nothing of the word fear. In September 1066, this huge fleet sailed across the North Sea, around the coast of Scotland, and down the east coast of England. The plan was bold: capture York, England's second most important city, and use it as a base to conquer the rest of the kingdom. The arrival of the Viking fleet caused panic in coastal communities. Villages were abandoned, farm animals were driven inland, and messengers rode frantically south, bringing terrifying news to King Harold in London. The first major battle happened on September 20th near the village of Fulford, just 2 miles from York. Earls Edwin of Mercia and Morcar of Northumbria gathered their forces to fight the invaders. It was a large army, perhaps 5,000 men, but they were facing Harald Hardrada at the peak of his military power. The Battle of Fulford was brutal and decisive. The Vikings, with their superior combat experience and Hardrada's masterful leadership, completely crushed the English army. Edwin and Morcar barely survived, but their forces were destroyed. The road to York was open. York surrendered without a fight. The citizens had no choice. Their defending army lay dead or scattered on the fields of Fulford, and the city walls could not survive a long siege by such a huge force. Harald Hardrada and Tostig entered the city triumphantly, receiving hostages and supplies. They had conquered northern England in just a few days. It seemed nothing could stop them. The Vikings celebrated, shared their loot, and planned their next moves. They had agreed to receive more hostages and supplies at a place called Stamford Bridge, about 8 miles east of York, on Monday, September 25th. But while the Vikings were celebrating their victory at York, hundreds of miles to the south, something extraordinary was happening. Harold Godwinson, upon hearing news of the Viking invasion, made a decision that shows why he was considered one of the greatest military commanders of his time. Rather than wait for Harald Hardrada to come to him, rather than give the invaders time to settle in their conquests, Harold decided to immediately march north and surprise the Vikings with a swift and devastating counterattack. What Harold did next is considered by military historians to be one of the most impressive forced marches of the medieval era. He gathered his army, the Huscarls, the elite English warriors, along with local militias known as the Feared, and began a march that defied human physical capabilities. From London to Tadcaster near York is about 220 miles. Harold covered this distance in just 5 days. This means his army was marching over 40 miles a day, carrying weapons, armor, and supplies along medieval roads that were little more than dirt paths. This forced march was the first sign of the secret weapon that would destroy the Vikings. It wasn't new technology. It wasn't a revolutionary combat tactic. It was something much more basic. It was speed. It was surprise. It was the ability to appear where the enemy least expected, when they least expected it. Harald Hardrada had won hundreds of battles, but he had never faced a commander with the boldness and determination of Harald Godwinson. On September 24th, Harold reached Tadcaster, just 15 miles from York. His men were exhausted, but he gave them no rest. The next day, September 25th, he marched through York and continued directly to Stamford Bridge, where he knew the Vikings would be gathering. Harold's speed had been so extraordinary that no one in York had time to warn Harald Hardrada. There were no mounted messengers racing ahead of the English army. There were no signal fires on the hills warning the invaders. Harold moved with a speed that seemed impossible by medieval standards. Meanwhile, at Stamford Bridge, Harald Hardrada and his Vikings were having a quiet day. The September sun shone warmly that morning, and many warriors had left their heaviest armor on their ships, which were anchored miles away at Recall. They were waiting for the local hostages to arrive, and the atmosphere was relaxed, almost like a party. Some men rested on the banks of the River Derwent. Others played dice. Some practiced with swords. There were not enough guards, no defensive formations prepared. Why should there be? They had just crushed an English army just 5 days earlier. There was no force in England that could threaten them so quickly. And then, on the horizon, something appeared that turned that sunny day into a nightmare. Dust. A huge cloud of dust rising from the road leading from York. And within that dust, the sun reflected off thousands of iron helmets, spears, and axes. An army was approaching, and it was approaching fast. The Vikings, at first confused, quickly realized the terrible truth. Harold Godwinson was there with his entire army, and they were completely unprepared. Harald Hardrada was not a man who panicked easily, even in that moment of extreme crisis. He stayed calm and began organizing his forces. But the situation was desperate. His men were scattered across a wide area, many without their full armor, and the English army was almost upon them. Hardrada did what any brilliant commander would do in those circumstances. He sent messengers rushing back to Recall, where the rest of his army and supplies were kept, urgently requesting reinforcements. He needed to buy time. This is where the land becomes important to understanding the battle. Stamford Bridge, as the name suggests, was a bridge crossing the River Derwent. The river wasn't particularly wide or deep under normal conditions, but its banks were muddy and slippery, making it difficult to cross quickly, especially for an entire army. The bridge itself was narrow, likely made of wood, and only capable of allowing a few men to pass side by side. This narrow point would be crucial in what happened next. Harald Hardrada quickly moved most of his forces to the east side of the bridge, setting up a defensive line on slightly higher ground. He left a smaller force on the west side of the bridge with the suicidal mission of delaying the English as long as possible. Among these men was a warrior whose name has been lost to history, but whose actions have become legendary. This single Viking, armed with a two-handed battle-axe, stood on the narrow bridge and declared that no Englishman would pass as long as he lived. What happened next has become legend, but is confirmed by multiple historical sources. This lone Viking warrior actually managed to hold back the entire front of the English army for quite some time. The bridge was so narrow that only 1 or 2 men could attack him at a time, and he cut them down one after another with powerful blows from his axe. According to the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, he killed 40 men single-handedly before finally being defeated. The story goes that eventually a clever English soldier managed to float under the bridge in a barrel or hollow log and stabbed the Viking from below with a spear. True or not, this story captures the desperate fierceness of the battle that was about to begin. When the English finally crossed the bridge in force, the real battle began. Harald Hardrada had used the time bought by his men's desperate heroism to organize a solid defensive formation. The Vikings formed a shield wall, a classic tactic where warriors stood shoulder to shoulder, their shields overlapping, creating a nearly impenetrable barrier. Behind this wall of wood and iron, spears and axes waited to strike down any who approached. It was a formation that had worked in countless battles from the fjords of Norway to the steppes of Russia. But Harold Godwinson had something most of the Vikings' previous opponents lacked. He had the Huskarls, arguably the finest infantry warriors in Europe at the time. The huscarls were professionals, men who dedicated their entire lives to the art of war. They carried Danish axes, terrifying weapons with blades that could cut a horse in half and slice through armor like butter. They also used the shield wall and had trained to fight in close formation since their youth. When two shield walls collided, it wasn't a matter of technology or numbers, but of endurance, skill, and sheer willpower. The initial clash between the two armies must have been apocalyptic. Imagine thousands of men rushing at each other, the sound of wood hitting wood, metal hitting metal, war cries mingling with screams of pain. On the front lines, warriors pushed with their shields, trying to create openings in the enemy defenses, while axes and swords sought exposed flesh. It was combat at its most brutal, where men could literally smell the breath of their enemies, where blood made the ground so slippery that keeping balance was a constant challenge. Harald Hardrada, despite being in his 50s, an advanced age for that time, fought on the front lines like a berserker from ancient legend. His towering presence and legendary skill inspired his men to feats of desperate bravery. But the lack of full armor on many of his warriors began to cost them. The fully equipped English huscarls were wreaking havoc on the Viking lines. Still, the Norsemen held their ground. They had sworn to fight to the death, and they were keeping that oath with fierce determination. Then something happened that changed everything. An arrow, one of thousands fired that bloody day, found its mark. Harald Hardrada, the last great Viking king, the warrior who had fought from the Mediterranean to the Arctic, was struck in the throat by an arrow. He fell, and with his fall, Viking morale suffered a devastating blow. Tostig, Harold's exiled brother, immediately took command and tried to regroup the forces, but the damage was done. Hardrada's death was not just the loss of a commander, it was the loss of a living legend, a symbol of Viking invincibility. Harold Godwinson, seeing the confusion in the enemy lines, offered terms of surrender through the battle. He called out to Tostig, his own brother, offering him pardon and the return of his lands if he would surrender. Tostig's response is recorded in several chronicles. He asked what Harold would offer Harald Hardrada. Harold replied that he would offer the Norwegian king 7 feet of English land, or perhaps more since he was so tall. In other words, only a grave. Tostig refused the offer, choosing to die with his allies rather than betray them and accept his brother's charity. The battle continued with renewed intensity. The Vikings, though shaken by the death of their king, fought with the desperate fury of men who knew there was no retreat. But then, at the worst possible moment for the Norsemen, the long-awaited reinforcements arrived from Recall. Eystein Orr, one of the Viking commanders, appeared with a fresh force left behind with the ships. They had run the 8 miles from Recall to Stamford Bridge in full armor, and many arrived so exhausted that they died of exhaustion before even fighting. Still, their arrival gave the Vikings renewed hope and prolonged the battle for several more bloody hours. This final phase of the battle was called Orr's Storm in the Norse sagas, a reference both to Eystein Orr's name and to the fury with which his men fought. But they were facing an enemy that had proven its superiority over a full day of relentless combat. The English huscarls, though tired, maintained their discipline and formations. Systematically, methodically, they destroyed the last pockets of Viking resistance. As the sun began to set that September evening, the Battle of Stamford Bridge was over. The field was covered with bodies. Estimates vary, but it's possible that between 6,000 and 9,000 Vikings died that day, including Harald Hardrada, Tostig, and most of Norway's warrior elite. On the English side, casualties were also severe, possibly 2,000 or more, but they had won a complete and decisive victory. Of the 300 ships that had brought the Viking invasion force, only 24 were needed to carry the survivors back to Norway. It was a massacre of epic proportions. But what was the real secret weapon that destroyed the Vikings that day? It wasn't new military technology. It wasn't having more soldiers. The armies were roughly equal in size. It wasn't better weapons. Both sides used similar equipment. The true secret weapon was a combination of tactical and strategic factors that together created a decisive advantage. First, there was the extraordinary speed of Harold Godwinson's march. This march from London to Stamford Bridge in just 5 days was an impressive feat that caught the Vikings completely unprepared. The resulting strategic surprise cannot be underestimated. The Vikings expected to have weeks, perhaps months, to consolidate their conquests in the north before facing Harold's main army. Instead, they were attacked within days while they were scattered, many without proper armor, and far from their supply bases. Second, it was the discipline and professionalism of the English huscarls. These elite warriors were as good as the best the Vikings could offer, and they were fighting on their own land with everything to lose. Their ability to maintain formations under extreme pressure and continue fighting effectively for hours was crucial to victory. Third, there was Harold Godwinson's tactical leadership. He recognized the opportunity the bridge offered to delay the initial Viking advance and used this time to optimally position his forces. Throughout the battle, he maintained control over his troops, prevented them from breaking as the fighting intensified, and exploited every weakness in the enemy lines. Fourth, and perhaps most important, was intelligence and the use of information. Harold knew exactly where the Vikings would be and when they would be there. He used this knowledge to plan a perfect surprise attack. Timing was everything, and Harold got it perfectly. The combination of these factors created a lethal combination that the Vikings, despite their bravery and skill, simply could not overcome. In essence, the secret weapon was a superior way of waging war, a more integrated and sophisticated approach to combat that combined strategic mobility, intelligence, tactical discipline, and inspired leadership. The consequences of the Battle of Stamford Bridge were profound and lasting. For Norway, it marked the end of an era. The death of Harald Hardrada and the destruction of much of the Norwegian warrior elite meant that Norway would never again pose a serious threat to England. The era of Viking invasions, which had terrorized Europe for over 2 centuries, was effectively over. Never again would a Viking army attempt to conquer England. For Harold Godwinson, the victory should have been the greatest triumph of his life. He had defeated one of the greatest warriors of the age, saved his kingdom from invasion, and proven himself a worthy king. But fate had other plans. Just 3 days after the battle, while Harold and his exhausted army were still in the north, news arrived that would change everything. William of Normandy had landed on the south coast of England with his invading army. The Norman Duke had taken advantage of Harold's absence to make his move. Harold had no choice. He had to march his exhausted army back south, another forced march of over 200 miles to face this new threat. His men were exhausted, many were wounded, and he had lost some of his best warriors at Stamford Bridge. Nevertheless, Harold rallied his forces and marched to meet William. On October 14, 1066, just 19 days after Stamford Bridge, the two forces met near Hastings. The Battle of Hastings is far more famous than Stamford Bridge, but in many ways it was Stamford Bridge that determined the outcome at Hastings. Harold's army was too exhausted, had marched too far, and fought too hard at Stamford Bridge. When the famous arrow struck Harold in the eye at Hastings, when the Normans finally broke the English lines, it was not only a victory for William, but also a direct consequence of what had happened at Stamford Bridge. It's interesting to imagine what might have happened if Harald Hardrada had been more cautious, if he had kept proper guards, if he had kept his army together and fully armed. Could he have defeated Harold at Stamford Bridge? And if he had, could he have become King of England? How would history have been different? Alternatively, imagine if Harold had had just a few more weeks to rest his army after Stamford Bridge, to regroup his forces and gather reinforcements from across the kingdom before facing William at Hastings. With a rested and reinforced army, it's quite possible Harold would have defeated the Normans. England would have remained Anglo-Saxon. The English language would have evolved very differently, and the entire history of England, and by extension the world, would have followed a completely different path. But history doesn't work with what-ifs. What happened happened, and its consequences shaped the world we live in today. The Battle of Stamford Bridge was the last great Anglo-Saxon military victory. It also marked the end of an era of Viking warriors and the beginning of a new European order, dominated by feudal powers like Normandy. For the Vikings who survived and returned to Norway, the defeat at Stamford Bridge was traumatic. They had set out as conquerors, certain of their glorious destiny, and returned defeated, their leaders dead, and their ambitions destroyed. The epic Norse sagas speak of the battle with a mixture of pride in the bravery displayed and regret at the magnitude of the defeat. For a culture that valued glory in battle above all else, Stamford Bridge was both a tragedy and a lesson in humility. Military historians continue to study Stamford Bridge for its lessons on the importance of preparation, military intelligence, and strategic speed. Harold's march from London to York remains cited as one of the most impressive examples of military mobility in the medieval era. Commanders throughout the centuries, from Napoleon to Patton, understood that speed and surprise can be as valuable as numerical strength or technological superiority. The battle also demonstrates the importance of morale and leadership. When Harald Hardrada fell, though his men continued to fight, something fundamental was lost. The presence of a charismatic and legendary leader can make a huge difference on the battlefield, and its loss can be devastating. Harold Godwinson understood this, and it is one of the reasons he personally fought on the front lines in both major battles he fought in 1066. It's also important to think about the human cost of these conflicts. Thousands of men died at Stamford Bridge, each with their own stories, families, hopes, and dreams. They were soldiers in power games played by kings and nobles, but they were also human individuals whose lives were cut short on the battlefield. Medieval warfare was brutal in a way that is difficult for us today to fully understand. The hand-to-hand combat, the direct physical killing, the extreme physical exhaustion. All of this created a horrific experience that thankfully few of us today need to face. The site of Stamford Bridge today is a peaceful place. There is a small plaque marking the approximate location of the battle, and the River Derwent still flows peacefully beneath the modern bridge that replaced the wooden one, where a lone Viking held an entire army at bay. The fields where thousands died are now productive farmland. Life went on as it always does, but the memory of that bloody September day remains. There's something deeply moving about visiting ancient battlefields and imagining the events that happened there. Stamford Bridge doesn't have the fame of Hastings or Waterloo, but what happened there was equally significant to the course of history. It was there that the Viking Age effectively ended. It was there that the last great Viking king fell. It was there that Anglo-Saxon England won its last great victory before being conquered by the Normans. The story of Stamford Bridge also teaches us about the nature of fortune in war. Harald Hardrada had been one of the most successful men of his time. He had won countless battles, amassed immense wealth, and conquered a kingdom. But all of this was lost in a single day of bad luck and poor decisions. A single arrow changed everything. This reminds us of the fragility of human destiny, and how even the mightiest can fall. The Vikings' inadequate preparation that day was the result of several things. First, there was the natural overconfidence of warriors who had just crushed an English army at Fulford. Second, there was the belief that Harold Godwinson was in London, and that it would take weeks to assemble and march an army north. Third, there was the warm weather of that September day, which made it tempting to leave heavy armor behind. Each of these decisions seemed reasonable at the time, but together they created a fatal vulnerability. Harold Godwinson, on the other hand, made decisions that seemed reckless at the time, but proved brilliant. Marching his army to the point of exhaustion was risky. It could have left his troops unable to fight effectively once they arrived. Attacking immediately without giving his men time to rest was another enormous risk, but Harold understood that surprise and speed were worth these risks. He bet everything on a single decisive blow, and it worked perfectly. The role of military intelligence in this campaign cannot be underestimated. Harold knew exactly where the Vikings would be and when. He likely had spies or informants in York who told him about the planned meeting at Stamford Bridge. This information allowed him to plan his attack with surgical precision. In medieval warfare, where communications were slow and information was often inaccurate, having precise knowledge of the enemy's movements was incredibly valuable. The land around Stamford Bridge deserves further consideration. The bridge itself was a natural choke point that favored defense. Had the Vikings had more time to prepare, they could have used the bridge to create a nearly impenetrable defense. After all, a single warrior was able to hold an entire army at bay for a significant amount of time. Imagine if Harald Hardrada had had time to position a substantial force at the bridge with adequate supplies of arrows and spears. The English could have been trapped on the other side of the river for hours, or even days. But Harold's speed denied the Vikings this opportunity. When the English arrived, the Vikings were still organizing, and only a limited number of warriors could be deployed to defend the bridge before it was too late. Once the English crossed in force, the battle became an open confrontation where numbers, equipment, and preparation made all the difference. The use of archers in battle is another interesting aspect. Although most medieval English combat at this time focused on heavy infantry with axes and swords, archers played a crucial role. It was an arrow that killed Harald Hardrada, fundamentally altering the course of the battle. This foreshadows the increasingly important role archers would play in future English wars, culminating in the devastating victories against French cavalry at Crécy and Agincourt centuries later. The question of armor is also interesting. Medieval armor of this period was primarily chainmail, thousands of interlocking metal rings that provided reasonable protection against cuts, but were heavy and hot. A fully armed warrior wearing full chainmail, helmet, and carrying shield and weapons could carry between 45 and 65 pounds of gear. On a hot September day, this became extremely uncomfortable. Many Vikings left their chainmail on ships, a decision that cost them their lives when English swords and axes found unprotected flesh. The English, having marched directly into battle, were all fully equipped. This difference in protection was significant in the fierce hand-to-hand combat that characterized the battle. A warrior in full armor had a substantial advantage over an opponent without adequate protection. No matter how skilled the unprotected fighter was, they were at a disadvantage. The psychology of combat also played a role. The Vikings, especially those who had fought in the Varangian Guard or other campaigns across the Mediterranean and Eastern Europe, were seasoned warriors who had seen countless battles. But the surprise of being attacked when they thought they were safe, the sight of their seemingly invincible king falling dead, these psychological shocks deeply affected their ability to fight effectively. On the English side, the Huscarls were fighting to defend their own country. They knew that if they failed, foreign invaders would conquer their lands. Their families could be killed or enslaved, and their culture could be destroyed. This kind of motivation, fighting to protect everything you value, can transform good soldiers into extraordinary warriors. The desperate defense of their homeland gave the English a fierceness that matched the legendary reputation of the Vikings. The tactics used in the battle reflect the nature of 11th century medieval combat. There was no heavy cavalry in this battle. Both sides fought primarily as infantry. Shield wall formations were the dominant tactic, creating solid lines of warriors who attempted to break enemy formations through brute force, superior skill, or tactical maneuvers. It was warfare of attrition in its purest form, where the side that could maintain its formation and continue fighting the longest would eventually win. Within these formations, the fighting was chaotic and brutal. Warriors in the front line thrust their shields against their enemies, trying to unbalance them or create openings. Through these openings, swords, axes, and spears were thrust, seeking any unprotected part of the enemy's body. Men in the back lines pushed those in front, adding weight and momentum to the formation. Wounded men fell and were trampled, creating obstacles that further complicated movement. The noise must have been deafening, the clash of metal on metal, wood on wood. The war cries, the screams of pain and terror, the commands shouted by officers trying to maintain order in their lines, and through it all, the unmistakable smell of blood, sweat, and fear. Medieval combat was a complete and overwhelming sensory experience that tested not only physical courage, but also mental endurance. The duration of the battle is also significant. Stamford Bridge lasted most of the day, likely beginning mid-morning and continuing until early evening. Sustaining intense physical combat for so many hours requires extraordinary endurance. The warriors weren't fighting continuously for this entire time. There were pauses when formations briefly separated, moments to catch their breath, drink water, and regroup. But even so, the physical and mental exhaustion must have been tremendous. To put this in perspective, extremely fit modern athletes struggle to sustain intense physical activity for more than an hour or two. These medieval warriors were fighting, carrying heavy equipment on a hot day for 6 or 8 hours. The level of physical conditioning required for this is staggering. These were men who had spent their entire lives training for war, whose bodies were fighting machines honed through years of practice and actual battle experience. The arrival of Rickall's Viking reinforcements at the battle's end adds a tragic dimension to the story. These men ran over 6 miles in full armor, an extraordinary physical feat in itself. They arrived expecting to save the day, rescue their comrades, and turn the tide of the battle. Instead, they found a scene of carnage where their friends and leaders were already dead or dying. Still, they fought, knowing defeat was likely, but maintaining their vows of loyalty to the bitter end. This fierce loyalty was a defining characteristic of Viking culture. A warrior sworn to serve a lord was expected to fight to the death at that lord's side. Fleeing a battle where their leader had fallen was the greatest dishonor imaginable. So these Viking reinforcements, even exhausted from their run, even seeing the desperate situation, threw themselves into battle with the fury of men who knew they were fighting their last battles. Orr's storm was intense but brief. The English had already proven their superiority throughout the day. They had the momentum, they had the confidence of imminent victory, and they had superior numbers at that point, as many Vikings had fallen. Systematically, the Viking lines were broken, surrounded, and destroyed. In the end, scattered survivors fled across the countryside, pursued by English horsemen who hunted them relentlessly. The aftermath of the battle must have been horrific. Thousands of bodies covered the fields around Stamford Bridge. The wounded moaned, begging for water or death to end their suffering. The English victors, themselves exhausted and many wounded, began the hard task of tending to their own wounded and collecting equipment and supplies from the dead. The dead Vikings were left where they fell, their bodies eventually buried in mass graves or left to decompose. For the surviving Vikings, the journey home was sad beyond words. They had set out from Norway with dreams of glory and conquest. They returned defeated, impoverished, and broken. Most of the Norwegian nobility had been killed in the battle. Entire families were destroyed. Villages were left without fighting-age men. It would take Norway decades to fully recover from this catastrophic loss. In England, the victory was celebrated, but briefly. News of the Norman invasion meant there was no time for prolonged celebrations. Harold immediately began preparing to march south, gathering new recruits to replace those lost at Stamford Bridge and sending messengers to gather militia from across the kingdom. But time was his enemy. Each passing day gave William of Normandy more time to consolidate his control of the southern coast and prepare his own defenses. Harold's decision to immediately march south to confront William was controversial, even at the time. Some of his advisors argued that he should wait, gather a larger army, and let his men rest and recover. But Harold had won at Stamford Bridge through speed and decisiveness, and he believed the same strategy would work against the Normans. Tragically this time, luck was not on his side. If we look at 1066 as a whole, we see a Shakespearean drama unfolding. 3 kings fight for a crown. Harold Godwinson wins the first battle spectacularly, only to lose the second and die on the battlefield. William of Normandy, who might have been defeated if Harold had had a rested army, instead conquers England and changes the course of Western history forever. Harald Hardrada, arguably the greatest warrior of his generation, dies in an ambush because he underestimated his opponent. There are lessons here that go beyond military history and touch on deeper truths about the human condition. Arrogance leads to downfall. Harald Hardrada learned that the hard way. Speed and decisiveness can overcome superior forces, as Harold demonstrated, but even brilliant victories can be hollow if they leave you vulnerable to new threats, as Harold also discovered. And fortune, pure chance, plays a huge role in determining who wins and who loses, who lives and who dies. The bridge at Stamford Bridge became a symbol of this greater truth. A simple wooden structure spanning a small river became the place where empires collided and the future was decided. It wasn't the most dramatic terrain. There were no majestic mountains or vast plains. It was just a river and a bridge in Yorkshire. But what happened there has echoed through the centuries. For the descendants of the fighters, the battle took on different meanings. For the English, it was the last great victory of their Anglo-Saxon ancestors before the Norman conquest. For the Norwegians and Scandinavians, it was a national tragedy and the end of an era of Viking glory. For the Normans, who would soon conquer England, Stamford Bridge was lucky for them. It weakened the English army and made their own victory at Hastings possible. Today, when we visit ancient battle sites, it's easy to forget the true human cost of what happened there. We see green fields and peaceful landscapes, and it's hard to imagine that thousands of men died there. But if we could go back in time and witness Stamford Bridge on that September day, we would see horror beyond imagination. We would see young men, many still teenagers, fighting and dying for causes they barely understood. We would see the brutality of medieval warfare in all its bloody reality. This isn't to glorify war or romanticize violence. It's to remind us of the true cost of ambition, power, and conflict. Every body on that battlefield represented a life lost, a family devastated, human potential wasted. History tends to focus on kings and commanders, but it's the common soldiers who pay the highest price. The secret weapon that destroyed the Vikings at Stamford Bridge was ultimately a combination of many factors working together. It was Harold Godwinson's strategic speed. It was the tactical surprise of his attack. It was the discipline and skill of the English huscarls. It was the Vikings' lack of preparation. It was the timely death of Harald Hardrada. It was the land that favored the attackers once they crossed the bridge. It was the superior morale of the English fighting to defend their homes. None of these factors alone would have been enough, but together they created a perfect storm that swept the Vikings from the battlefield. This lesson in joint warfare, about integrating multiple elements into a coherent strategy, remains relevant today. Modern militaries study Stamford Bridge not because the specific tactics are still applicable, no one fights with shield walls anymore, but because the underlying principles are timeless. Speed, surprise, intelligence, morale, leadership, and preparation. All these factors continue to determine victories and defeats in contemporary conflicts. To conclude our journey through this extraordinary battle, we must reflect on its place in the larger story. Stamford Bridge is not as famous as Hastings, Agincourt, or Waterloo, but in terms of historical impact, it is equally significant. It marked the definitive end of the Viking Age, an era that had shaped Europe for more than 2 centuries. It was the last time a large Scandinavian army would attempt to conquer England. It demonstrated that the Anglo-Saxons, when led effectively, were as capable as any military force in Europe. And ironically, by destroying the Vikings so completely, Harold Godwinson sealed his own fate. If Stamford Bridge hadn't been so costly, if Harold had had more time to prepare before facing William, history would have been very different. But history offers no second chances. Decisions are made, battles are fought, and we live with the consequences. As the sun set over the blood-stained fields of Stamford Bridge that September evening, no one could have fully predicted what would come next. The surviving Vikings began their long journey home, carrying tales of terror and tragedy. Harold Godwinson began planning his next campaign, little knowing that in less than 3 weeks he would be dead and his kingdom conquered. And somewhere in southern England, William of Normandy waited, his fortunes changing with every hour Harold remained in the north. The Battle of Stamford Bridge was a moment of pure historical simplicity, a straightforward clash of forces where the best leadership, preparation, and execution prevailed. There were no complex betrayals, no drawn-out political intrigues affecting the outcome. It was simply 2 armies facing off, and the best prevailed that day. There was something almost pure in this simplicity, even amid the horror of war. The lessons of Stamford Bridge echo through the centuries. For leaders, it teaches the importance of never underestimating your opponents and always maintaining adequate preparation. For strategists, it demonstrates the invaluable value of speed and surprise. For soldiers, it shows that discipline and training are as important as raw courage. And for all of us, it reminds us that history is made by human decisions, some wise, some reckless, but all with consequences that echo far beyond the moment they are made. As we close this story of the battle that destroyed the Vikings, we must acknowledge that despite all the violence, all the death, and all the suffering, there are also stories of extraordinary courage. The lone Viking who defended the bridge alone, knowing he would die, but buying time for his comrades. Eystein Orr and his men rushing into battle, even exhausted, to help their friends. Harold Godwinson marching his army beyond the limits of human endurance to defend his kingdom. Harald Hardrada fighting on the front lines despite his advanced age. These stories of courage go beyond sides and nationalities. They speak of the human capacity to act heroically, even in the most terrible circumstances. And so the story of the Battle of Stamford Bridge leaves us with complex thoughts. It was a brilliant victory for Anglo-Saxon England, but one that would lead directly to its own destruction just weeks later. It was the end of the Viking Age, but what a glorious end it was, fighting against impossible odds to the last man. It was a demonstration that superior leadership and clever strategy can defeat even the most feared warriors, but also a reminder that fortunes can change in an instant. The fields around Stamford Bridge are peaceful today, but if we could listen back through the centuries, perhaps we could still hear the echoes of that terrible and glorious day. The clash of shields, the screams of warriors, the groans of the wounded, and through it all the silent testimony of thousands of men who fought and died there, their names lost to history, but their actions shaping the world we live in today. The secret weapon that destroyed the Vikings was ultimately human will, applied with intelligence, speed, and ruthless determination. It was Harold Godwinson's refusal to accept defeat, his willingness to risk everything on a daring move, and his ability to inspire his men to extraordinary feats. It was proof that in war, as in life, it is not always the strongest or the most experienced who win, but those who adapt quickest, think most clearly, and act most decisively. And with that, we come to the end of this epic journey through one of the most significant days in medieval history. The Battle of Stamford Bridge remains a testament to human courage, the brutality of war, and the unpredictable role of fate in determining the course of history. May we remember the lessons of this battle, honor the memory of those who fought and died there, and be grateful that we live in an age where such bloody conflicts are no longer the norm in much of the world. As we think about all we have discussed, the lives lost, the decisions made, and the consequences that shaped centuries of history, we are led to a deep sense of gratitude. Gratitude for those who came before us, whose struggles and sacrifices created the world we inherited. Gratitude for the opportunity to learn from the past, to understand the forces that shaped our civilization, and above all, gratitude to the Lord God, who in His infinite wisdom guides the course of human history through all its twists and turns. Who was present on that battlefield in 1066 as He is present with us today, who offers hope even in the midst of despair, and who through all the triumphs and tragedies of human history remains steadfast and faithful. May we have the wisdom to learn from the past, the courage to face the present, and the faith to trust in the future, always remembering that our existence and all its possibilities are precious gifts granted by God. Amen.